From the Toronto Star, I'm Rudgy Mudler, and this matters. Happy 2022, everybody. New year, new you, right? We wish you all the best for the year ahead. For many of you, the new year is probably starting with plans to exercise more and live a healthier lifestyle, which often means going alcohol-free for the first month of the year. It's something better known as Dry January, and while we commend you for your efforts, we decided to take a look at this phenomenon and see just where it comes from, and maybe offer a few helpful tips if you attempt to abstain from booze this month. Christine Sismondo is someone who writes about all kinds of things, but she has written an awful lot about drinks. She is the author of several alcohol-related books, including America Walks Into a Bar, A Spirited History of Taverns, Saloons, Speakeasies, and Grog Shops, and the upcoming Mocktails, A Still Life. She joins us to talk a little bit about Dry January. Christine, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
So Christine, I want us to have fun with this. And I know you have a bit of an ambivalent attitude toward Dry January, and we're going to get to that. But I know you know your drinking history and all about temperance movements, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But first, what do we know about the origins of Dry January?
So it's funny, I've never really looked into this all that carefully until relatively recently. And I see that it really hasn't taken off until quite recently, that this is quite a modern movement that the last maybe 5-10 years. But I can certainly remember people taking January off for as long as when I was working in bars, January was the slowest month. So then looking back a little bit further, it turns out that there is this sober January month from 1942 in Finland, which is kind of an interesting, because I knew it went back further, but I didn't know it went back that far.
You know, it's funny. It is one of these things that I think it's a lot of things with charities and some European countries have kind of co-opted it as a movement. We have to get this idea out there. So it's the idea that basically, you drink so much in December that you want to take January off. Let's be very real. That's not a thing, right? Bodies don't work like that. It's funny. I have a kid, and before I had a kid, people said, "Oh, get your sleep now." You can't store sleep. So I think that the idea of taking a month off, hey, I think we agree that moderation, particularly when it comes to alcohol, is a good thing. But in terms of taking a month off, does it actually have any benefits as far as we know?
Well, so I always thought that it was ridiculous, that I always thought it made more sense to do something where you periodically took time off throughout the year, a few days a week or something along those lines, because that would amount to far more than 30 days or 31 days. And to try to figure out how to kind of, pace yourself and have a moderate drinking life throughout the entire year, not just take 1 month off and then in February, you're right back at it, that kind of thing, which I do think happens. But I spoke to an addiction researcher who specializes in alcohol about a year and a half ago, maybe a little bit more. And he said, in his experience, he finds people really benefit from this idea of a reset, and that people really benefit from learning how to do things that aren't just about alcohol, and that they can carry these habits forward well past January, and that you really do feel better. By January 27 or 28, you start to feel something that's a reward that makes you kind of encouraged to go forward drinking less, or perhaps continuing on and not drinking. So I'm willing to admit that I might have been wrong about that, but it's not my gut instinct.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with him. But anyways, we're going to get to that. I think one of the key things about this, and this is probably one of the things different from history, is that this is very personal. I would think that the temperance movements of the past were very public and much more about sort of the evils of liquor. Is that right? Is that fair to say? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, and also I think that one thing we always sort of refer to temperance and we talk about it as though that's not drinking, but temperance is really also about moderation, right? You're tempered, and temperance came to mean abstinence, but it didn't start out that way. The temperance movements were really made much more radical throughout the 1800s. And that's when they moved to a spot of absolutism and you have to get on the wagon. And that's when you start to see things like prohibition come in. So the meaning of the movement really changed over time. And it also is important to remember that, yes, it was very much about the evils of liquor, as you point out, and that people really did drink too much at one point. And maybe arguably we drink too much now, but not getting into that necessarily. It was clear that people did drink too much in, say, 1840s America, when people were consuming something like 7 gallons of absolute alcohol per person per year. That was a lot. That was more than we could probably handle. So a lot of the temperance movement grew out of a reaction to a real problem that was actually happening.
Well, let's get back to this sort of idea of dry January. And obviously, there's other versions of this, sober October. I've heard dry February as well, just because it's the shortest month. And that's the kind of practicality I actually want to talk about. I'll be very honest. I tried this a few years ago.
Yeah.
And I found it very hard.
Okay.
I did pretty good, but I caved like 5 times. And that was it. It was one of these things that whenever I caved, I felt so badly about it. And one of the things that I will also say, if you want someone to buy you a drink, go to the bar and tell them you are not drinking. It works every single time.
That's great. I never thought of that.
I'm telling you, every time I actually bothered to meet somebody at a place, and then I'd be like, oh, I'm not drinking. Be like, oh, why? Can I buy you a beer? Can you buy you a beer? And of course, it led to caving. So we have to talk about this idea, very practical. And, we're talking today, this airing on probably the first week of January. So people are just getting into this. What advice do you have? I think the first might be moderation is probably a good goal as opposed to total abstinence. Is that right? Is that fair to say?
I mean, I think for me, and as you say, I think these are personal solutions, and I think for me that the idea of saying I'm never going to have a glass of wine, no matter what the dinner in front of me looks like, is kind of a tough one, because I don't eat that much meat. But what if a steak appeared, then I'd really want a glass of red wine in front of me, right? And so I find that very difficult. And then, there are social occasions that pop up that really, they don't necessarily have to include alcohol, but we're kind of used to having alcohol involved. So I worked at a Habs bar for a while, and this was actually the last bar job I held, and by far the longest bar job I held. And I'm not actually a hockey fan, but one of the owners, he would say, okay, well, I'm going to take this month off, but I'm going to prearrange these penalty days. And he would say, I know I have to go to this game on this day, and I know I have to do this on this day. And he would say, but those are penalty days that I get for free. And I mean, really, if you drank for 4 or 5 days in a month, that's not that different from taking the month off, right?
You particularly, as a drinks writer, I think one of the reasons you probably deserve to hate this is that you get asked to write about it every January or do podcasts about it, right? Is that fair? Am I right on that one?
That's funny. I opened up an article at one year saying, we are legally obliged, all drinks writers, to start our first column of the year with, so it's dry January. This is what you should do.
We'll be right back. What about drinks that actually work well in winter? What are things that maybe, if you are, say, abstaining for much of the week, what would be something you recommend for someone to enjoy, say, the nice cold weather?
You mean completely non-alcoholic then, right?
Let's cheat on this one, right? Because you are a drinks writer. If I'm willing to cheat in dry January, what's a nice drink to have?
So one thing that I've done over the years is that I have looked for spirit substitutes, we'll call them. They're actually mostly wines, but things like port, Fino sherry, and vermouth as a nice moderate sort of base for a cocktail. And so you can build something with, 2 ounces of scotch or even, more overproof bourbon, and that's going to make a drink that's a much higher proof. Or you can do like Fino sherry and tonic, and you sort of get to enjoy your drink, but without kind of not being able to cook your dinner anymore or something like that. So I think that those kind of shoulder drinks that are they're really quite temperate, but they're not 100% dry, are one way to go in January, because then, you're still kind of getting rid of the hangover of Christmas with, by not drinking too much, and you don't feel bad, but you still get a little lift.
Now let's go to, we're going to do dry January for real. What are some of the options? I think mocktails are one of these things that actually have come a really, really long way.
Yeah, absolutely. The bars, I think they want to be more inclusive, and that's a big part of it. And also, it's just boring. I'm drinking soda water right now. How many soda waters can you have, or refills of free pop forever? And now all of a sudden, there are these almost essentially 100% non-alcoholic cocktails. Some of them contain traces of alcohol because of the de-alcoholization process. It's hard to get absolutely everything out. And some of this is fueled by a bunch of new products that have been released, and they include things like Seedlip and Cedars. And there's actually over 100 non-alcoholic distilled spirits on the market globally now that you can use that we don't get them all in Canada, but we must get about 10 here at least. And you can use them to make a non-alcoholic, something that looks and tastes fairly close to a gin and tonic. And you pour it the exact same way and you drink it the exact same way. Now, I used to think it was kind of silly because I thought it's a lot of money to spend on, why not just drink tonic? But, do you really need this sort of non-alcoholic thing? A lot of them are in the neighborhood of $30, $40, the same price as a bottle of liquor. And I thought I don't need to do that. But I tried it a few times and I thought there is something about the ritual of building yourself a drink that gives you kind of some of the same satisfaction that you would have if you were making a real gin and tonic. So, I'm ambivalent about that too.
You just mentioned the Seedlip stuff, which I had never heard of. And so I took a look into it. So basically it's something that sort of create sort of the feeling, I guess, the power of alcohol without it, I guess, the punch. What's a good way to describe sort of what it's like in the drink, I guess?
Well, I guess Seedlip isn't faux gin per se, because they just call themselves a faux spirit. But if you think of a gin and how it has those flavors, the botanicals that are like the sharp, piney juniper and the citrus peel, and then, a few other herbs and earthy herbs that are put in there. And then you think, well, if you can make something that's non-alcoholic but has a lot of those characteristics, then it can kind of pass for gin. If you add a little tonic, you could really easily be fooled and think that this is a gin and tonic. And if you weren't really paying close attention, you might not notice at all.
There's also some non-alcoholic beers. I think one of the ones I'll shout out is Partake. I've been surprised at how good that stuff tastes, actually. But I want to bring up a point that I think that you mentioned earlier when you talked to the addiction research person, and I think that this is something that did help me when I tried. It's the behaviors that you have. One of that month, it's better for me not to go to a bar because I will not drink. It's better to go for a walk. I think that's a very good piece of advice. Think about what you do when you're drinking, and if you don't want to, do some other things and find activities, fun things to keep you busy, right? Is that a good way to sort of approach this?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that I dislike about dry January is that this just doesn't seem like the right month when you live in Canada to decide that you're going to go and embark on some big change. It's dark, it's depressing, it's cold, you're at home all the time. And so, I don't know, this just seems like the wrong time of year to make a big resolution or to make a big change. And I think that one of the ways that we can combat it probably is by doing just completely different things so that we're not stuck inside the entire time, especially with COVID.
Especially with COVID. Absolutely. As if it's not hard enough already.
Exactly. Yeah.
My other piece of advice is, you should just take it easy on yourself. And if you cut down, that's fine. And if you cave, that's fine too. It's a new year. Let's all forgive ourselves a little bit, right?
Sure. I think so. You're supposed to be kind to yourself. That's what all the mindfulness teaching is about, right?
It's funny. This is one of those weird conversations because we've been talking about not drinking. And of course, I've gotten some drinking in here. I've got you. Any trends, any hot drinking trends in the new year? Anything that you think that's going to be big?
Yeah, I think the non-alcoholic spirits are actually only going to get bigger. And I know we don't want to get into that too much, but Tanqueray is putting out a non-alcoholic gin. So I'll be looking forward to trying that. And then when it comes to other more potent potables, I think that the highball is really coming back. The highball is making a comeback. So I think that we're going to see a lot more kind of refreshing tall drinks, as opposed to currently, the cocktail bars have been all about these sort of pretty little 3 or 4 ounce spirit forward drinks. And we're starting to move away from that. And perhaps some of that is about the fact that people have decided they can't handle too many of those in a row. But I think you can look at more tall, refreshing drinks in 2022 for sure.
Well, I'm amazed at sort of the mixology scene in this city right now and how much it's actually evolved over time. Be mocktails and cocktails as well. It's just really, really interesting out there. I'll be honest, I plan on trying to cut down a little bit in January. I definitely not will be cutting it all out. But Christina, is there anything that I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know?
I think you kind of set it up perfectly for something that I have been thinking about. One thing that I've always heard, and I don't think that any modern doctor would say this today, but I had some friends who had a doctor who, had been practicing for a long time. And he would say to my friend, 1 month a year, 1 week a month, 1 day a week. And that this was a formula for making sure that you were taking enough time off of alcohol. Now, those aren't days that you drink. Those are days that you don't drink. That is probably a lot more drinking than most modern doctors would recommend, but it's a really attainable goal. So if I were looking to sort of step things back, I would be thinking along that framework and trying to start with that, because they say small little changes are the way to go. So 1 day a week, well, anyone can do that, right?
Absolutely. It's a great way to start. Christine, listen, I really want to thank you so much for your time, and I wish you a wonderful 2022.
Thank you. You too.
Christine Sismondo is a freelance writer and author who lives in Toronto. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Raju Mudder. Our This Matters team is Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachneck, Saba Etizaz, and Sean Pattenden. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenden. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.